The simple truth. The transport truck lurched to a stop on the frozen ground outside Nizhny Tagil, its canvas cover crackling with accumulated ice. Mikhail Kalashnikov stepped down carefully, favoring his injured shoulder as the December wind of 1942 cut through his hospital-issued coat. Around him, other recovering soldiers and technicians gathered their meager belongings, their breath forming small clouds in the Siberian air. The weapons development facility stretched before them, a collection of low buildings and converted railway cars that would house the Soviet Union's most desperate engineering project. The smell hit him first, machine oil mixed with coal smoke and the sharp scent of metal filings. It was the smell of work, of possibility, of men trying to solve impossible problems with their hands. Mikhail breathed it in deeply, his first taste of hope since waking up in that shell crater near Bryansk 14 months ago. "Welcome to the future of Soviet small arms," a gruff supervisor announced to the group. "Most of you won't last a month. The work is 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The problems you'll face would break engineers with twice your education." Mikhail touched the sketches folded in his coat pocket, pages covered with mechanical drawings he'd made during those feverish nights in the hospital. The other men around him carried formal credentials, letters of recommendation, certificates from technical institutes. What he carried instead was something far more personal. The memory of good soldiers dying because they'd been sent to fight automatic weapons with single-shot rifles. The supervisor's eyes stopped on Mikhail. "You're the tank mechanic who thinks he can design rifles." "Yes, sir. You know the difference between fixing a transmission and creating a weapon that could arm millions of soldiers." Mikhail remembered the T-34's final moments, the way German submachine guns had cut down the infantry who'd tried to reach his burning tank. He thought of the letter from his sister, describing how village boys were being sent to the front with rifles that belonged to the last war. "I know the difference between weapons that work and weapons that fail when soldiers need them most." Something shifted in the supervisor's expression. He led Mikhail toward a converted railway car that served as a workshop, past windows where other designers hunched over drafting tables in the pale winter light. "The problem isn't just mechanical," the supervisor said quietly. "The generals still believe automatic weapons waste ammunition. They think peasant soldiers can't be trusted with rapid fire. You're not just fighting engineering challenges, you're fighting doctrine that's older than the revolution." Inside the railway car, Mikhail saw his assigned workspace, a wooden table, basic tools, and a small stove that barely warmed the air. On a shelf nearby sat several failed prototypes from other designers, complex mechanisms that had jammed, overheated, or simply fallen apart under battlefield conditions. He spread his hospital sketches across the table, drawings that emphasized simplicity over sophistication. The other designers glanced over, some smirking at the crude diagrams, others studying them with unexpected interest. "The Germans proved automatic rifles can work with the STG-44, one of them said, "but our factories can't maintain the tolerances those designs require. Post-war production needs to work even when everything isn't perfect." That night, as snow accumulated against the windows of the railway car workshop, Mikhail began his first formal prototype. He thought about the soldiers he'd served with, men who'd learned to fight with equipment that often broke, in conditions that destroyed precision instruments. Whatever he created would need to function when caked with mud, frozen solid, or dropped from a moving truck. The sketch he'd made in the hospital bed began to take three-dimensional form. Each component was designed not for elegance, but for reliability. Each part was meant to work even when other parts failed. It was ugly by engineering standards, heavy by military preferences, but it represented something new, a weapon designed around the reality of how wars were actually fought. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. The winter of 1943 brought news from the front that confirmed Mikhail's worst fears. Letters from soldiers described the same desperate reality he'd witnessed at Bryansk. Red Army infantry falling in waves because they faced automatic fire with bolt-action rifles. The Soviet High Command's response remained unchanged. Disciplined marksmanship and bayonet charges would overcome technical disadvantages. It was a doctrine rooted in Civil War victories, blind to the mechanized reality of modern warfare. In the railway car workshop, Mikhail worked through the systematic challenges that had defeated previous designers. The gas-operated system that would cycle the rifle's action required a delicate balance. Enough power to function reliably, not so much that it destroyed the mechanism. Traditional designs demanded precision manufacturing that Soviet factories, still rebuilding from wartime devastation, simply couldn't achieve consistently. "You're approaching this backwards," his supervisor observed one morning, studying Mikhail's latest drawings. "Every other designer starts with ideal specifications and works down. You're starting with what our factories can actually build, because that's what soldiers will actually carry." The distinction mattered more than engineering elegance. While university-trained designers pursued complex solutions that looked impressive on paper, Mikhail obsessed over simplicity. Every component was stripped to its essential function. Every mechanism was designed to tolerate loose tolerances, dirt, and abuse. His first complete prototype emerged in March 1943, assembled from parts machined in the facility's basic shop. It was crude, heavy, and aesthetically unappealing. When he test-fired it the next morning, it jammed after 6 rounds. The failure sent him back to his drafting table, but not in defeat. Each malfunction taught him something about the relationship between moving parts, gas pressure, and the realities of field conditions. He redesigned the bolt carrier, simplified the trigger mechanism, and created looser tolerances that actually improved function rather than degrading it. "Most rifles work best when everything fits perfectly," he explained to a fellow designer. "I'm trying to build one that works better when nothing fits perfectly." The breakthrough came during a particularly bitter night in late 1946. Mikhail had been struggling with the gas-operated mechanism for months, watching prototype after prototype fail in testing. Traditional approaches required precision that Soviet manufacturing simply couldn't maintain. In a moment of desperate inspiration, born from exhaustion and frustration, he inverted the entire problem. Instead of designing around tight tolerances, he redesigned the system around loose ones. The mechanism that emerged from that night's work actually benefited from imperfect manufacturing. Parts that didn't fit exactly created the clearances that allowed the rifle to function in adverse conditions. When he test-fired the new prototype the next morning, it cycled through magazine after magazine without a single malfunction. The other designers gathered around as Mikhail ran the rifle through tests that would destroy more sophisticated weapons. Buried in sand, submerged in muddy water, frozen solid overnight, then fired continuously until the barrel glowed. It worked. The rifle that emerged from those tests was ugly, heavy, and crude by traditional engineering standards. But it represented something revolutionary. A weapon designed around the assumption that war was chaos, that soldiers were often exhausted and poorly trained, that equipment would be abused and neglected and still expected to function when lives depended on it. "It looks like something a peasant would build," one designer said dismissively. "Good," Mikhail replied. "Peasants are who will carry it." The official tests began in the summer of 1947 at proving grounds outside Moscow. Senior military officials arrived to observe weapons trials that would determine the future of Soviet small arms doctrine. Among the competing designs was Mikhail's crude, heavy prototype, designated the AK-47 in recognition of its designer and year of completion. The testing protocol was designed to break weapons. Rifles were buried in sand, submerged in swamps, frozen solid, and subjected to impacts that shattered conventional firearms. Most prototypes failed within hours. Sophisticated designs with tight tolerances jammed when dirt accumulated in their mechanisms. Lightweight weapons couldn't withstand the forces generated by repeated automatic fire. The AK-47 endured everything the testers could devise. More importantly, it required minimal training, a crucial advantage for the Soviet Union's largely peasant army. Soldiers could field, strip, and reassemble the rifle in darkness. The simple controls and forgiving tolerances meant that exhausted, frightened troops could still operate the weapon effectively. "This weapon violates every principle of proper rifle design," one senior engineer complained during the trials. "It's too heavy, too crude, and the tolerances are unacceptably loose." "Can you break it?" the testing supervisor asked. 3 days of abuse had failed to cause a single malfunction. The rifle that military doctrine had deemed impossible was proving more reliable than weapons developed over decades by teams of university-trained engineers. During the trials, Mikhail received a letter from his sister in Kazakhstan. She wrote of village boys being drafted, sent to training camps where they learned to shoot rifles designed in the previous century. The gap between what the military was teaching and what soldiers actually faced in combat remained vast. "My neighbor's son came home on leave," she wrote. "He said German soldiers can fire continuously, while our boys have to stop and reload after every shot. He asked why we send good men to fight with tools from our grandfather's time." The letter struck Mikhail with unexpected force. The weapon he was creating wasn't an abstract engineering challenge, it was personal. Every design decision would determine whether soldiers like his nephew would come home alive. As the testing continued, something troubling began to emerge. The rifle's simplicity and reliability made it ideal not just for Soviet forces, but for mass production in any moderately industrialized nation. The loose tolerances that made it function in harsh conditions also made it easier to manufacture without sophisticated equipment. "If this design is adopted," a testing official noted quietly, "it could be produced anywhere." The simplicity that makes it reliable also makes it impossible to control. Mikhail hadn't considered this implication. He'd designed the rifle to protect Soviet soldiers, but its very effectiveness could make it a global phenomenon. The weapon intended to defend his homeland might eventually arm conflicts far from Soviet borders. The final test came in November 1947. 3 rifles were selected for extended field trials, the AK-47 and 2 competing designs from established arms manufacturers. Each would be subjected to 6 months of use by regular army units under actual service conditions. The results confirmed what the proving ground tests had suggested. Sophisticated rifles failed when soldiers used them as intended. Complex mechanisms jammed in field conditions. Tight tolerances became liabilities when weapons weren't maintained by trained armorers. The AK-47 simply worked. Soldiers reported that the rifle functioned reliably regardless of weather, maintenance schedules, or user skill level. The weapon that looked crude performed with unprecedented consistency. "Your rifle has been selected for production," the testing supervisor informed Mikhail in December 1947. "Congratulations, you've solved the problem that defeated the best engineers in the Soviet Union." But even as he shook hands and accepted formal recognition, Mikhail felt a shadow of unease. The problem he'd solved was larger than Soviet small arms doctrine. He'd created something that would change the nature of warfare itself, and that change would extend far beyond the borders of his homeland. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Production of the AK-47 began in 1949 at the Izhevsk Mechanical Works, a sprawling industrial complex that had manufactured rifles since the 19th century. Mikhail found himself transformed from an unknown mechanic into a celebrated weapons designer, awarded medals and privileges that still felt surreal. But as production lines assembled the first rifles, he began to understand the full implications of what he had created. The weapon's simple design proved as revolutionary in manufacturing as it had been in testing. Traditional rifles required skilled machinists and precise equipment. The AK-47 could be produced by moderately trained workers using basic industrial tools. The loose tolerances that made it reliable in combat made it economical to manufacture at scale. "We're producing 2,000 rifles per month," the factory supervisor reported during a production meeting. "Quality remains consistent. The design's tolerance for variation means we can maintain standards even with our current workforce limitations." Mikhail walked the production floor, watching workers assemble components he'd sketched in a converted railway car. Each rifle was identical in function, but subtly different in detail, exactly as he'd intended. The weapon was designed to work despite imperfections, not because everything was perfect, but reports from the field began to tell a more complex story. The rifle's effectiveness was transforming Soviet military doctrine, just as Mikhail had hoped. Infantry units could now engage opponents on equal terms. The single-shot disadvantage that had cost so many lives was finally eliminated. Yet the same simplicity that made the rifle effective for Soviet forces was already attracting international attention. Foreign military observers studied the weapon's design principles. Intelligence reports suggested that other nations were analyzing captured rifles and developing their own production capabilities. "Your design is too good," an official from the Defense Ministry observed during a factory inspection. "It solves the automatic rifle problem so completely that everyone will want to copy it." The comment haunted Mikhail. He'd intended to create a defensive weapon to protect his homeland. Instead, he'd engineered something that could be reproduced anywhere by anyone with basic industrial capacity. Letters from soldiers began arriving at the factory, testimonials from troops who credited the rifle with their survival. A tank commander wrote that his crew had defended their position against German paratroopers using AK-47s abandoned by retreating infantry. A reconnaissance sergeant described how the rifle's reliability had enabled his unit to break through encirclement during the final push toward Berlin. Each letter should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Mikhail found himself wondering what would happen when the war ended, when the rifles designed to protect Soviet soldiers spread beyond Soviet control. The answer began emerging in 1949 as Soviet advisors delivered weapons to communist forces in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. The rifle's simple design made it ideal for guerrilla armies and liberation movements. Its reliability made it effective in the hands of minimally trained fighters operating far from conventional supply lines. "The weapon you created is becoming a symbol," a visiting journalist explained during a factory tour. "Not just of Soviet military capability, but of revolutionary struggle worldwide." Mikhail hadn't considered this symbolic dimension. He'd designed a tool to solve a specific tactical problem. The rifle's effectiveness had transformed it into something larger, an instrument of political change, a means for non-industrial nations to arm effective military forces. As production expanded and export agreements multiplied, Mikhail began to grasp the scale of what was unfolding. The simple, reliable rifle born from his hospital bed sketches was becoming the most widely distributed automatic weapon in human history. The peasant's solution to military inequality was creating a new kind of equality, one where any determined group could access effective small arms. The moral weight of this reality began to settle on him like winter cold in Siberia. He'd wanted to save Soviet lives. Instead, he'd created an instrument that would enable conflicts far beyond anything he'd imagined. By 1955, the true scope of Mikhail's creation had become undeniable. Intelligence reports detailed AK-47 production in China, North Korea, and Eastern European nations. The rifle's simple design had enabled rapid technology transfer to any country with basic manufacturing capability. What began as a solution to Soviet tactical problems was becoming a global phenomenon. The central revelation came during a classified briefing in Moscow, where defense officials presented evidence of the weapon's worldwide proliferation. Mikhail sat in a sterile conference room, listening to statistics that transformed his engineering triumph into something far more complex and troubling. Current estimates suggest over 500,000 AK-47 rifles have been produced across multiple countries, an intelligence officer reported. The design's simplicity has made it impossible to control. Any nation with modest industrial capacity can manufacture effective versions. The briefing continued with reports from conflicts where Soviet-designed weapons were being used by both sides, where liberation movements and government forces carried identical rifles, where the tool created to defend communism was enabling wars that served no Soviet strategic interest. In some regions, your rifle has become more common than food or clean water, the officer continued. It's become the universal solution to military weakness. Revolutionary groups, tribal militias, criminal organizations all have access to what was intended as a state military weapon. Mikhail stared at the maps showing distribution patterns, conflict zones where his design was spreading like a technical virus. Each mark represented thousands of rifles, millions of individual decisions to pick up a weapon that had emerged from his determination to protect Soviet soldiers. The symbolic artifact that would haunt him for the rest of his life wasn't the rifle itself, but a photograph shown during that briefing. A young boy, perhaps 12 years old, carrying an AK-47 through the ruins of a distant city. The child's eyes held an expression Mikhail recognized from his own childhood, the focused intensity of someone trying to understand how broken things could be made to work again. But this boy wasn't repairing farm equipment. He was learning to use a weapon designed by a man who'd never imagined children would carry the tools of his engineering genius. The rifle has become divorced from its original purpose, the intelligence officer concluded. It's no longer a Soviet weapon. It's become something closer to a natural phenomenon, available wherever there's conflict, effective regardless of political ideology or military training. After the briefing, Mikhail walked through Moscow's streets, seeing his city through different eyes. Every soldier, every security guard carried weapons derived from his designs. The simple, reliable rifle had become so fundamental to military planning that its absence was now unthinkable. But beyond Soviet borders, that same reliability was enabling conflicts that served no defensive purpose. The weapon created to protect was becoming synonymous with aggression, insurgency, and endless regional wars. The simple truth of its effectiveness had made it the preferred tool for anyone seeking to challenge established power through force. "Do you ever regret creating it?" a young engineer asked during a visit to the Izhevsk factory. Mikhail studied the production line, where workers assembled rifles with the mechanical precision he'd once applied to farm equipment repairs. Each weapon would function reliably for decades, in conditions its original designer had never imagined, serving purposes he'd never intended. "I regret that the problem it was meant to solve has become so widespread," he replied finally. "I wanted to save Soviet lives. I didn't anticipate creating something that would make violence more accessible worldwide." The young engineer considered this. But without it, wouldn't our soldiers still be fighting automatic weapons with bolt-action rifles? It was the question that would define Mikhail's remaining decades. Had he solved a military problem? Or had he simply democratized the tools of warfare in ways that made conflict more persistent and widespread? The rifle worked exactly as designed, but its very effectiveness had consequences no single designer could have anticipated or controlled. The final decades of Mikhail Kalashnikov's life were shaped by a contradiction he could never fully resolve. The weapon that had made him a hero of Soviet engineering had become the most widely distributed instrument of violence in human history. By the 1990s, an estimated 100 million AK-47s and variants existed worldwide, more than all other assault rifles combined. The Cold War's end brought new revelations about his rifle's global impact. Former Soviet allies had not only manufactured their own versions, but had exported them to movements and governments across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The simple design that made the weapon reliable also made it impossible to control once the manufacturing knowledge spread. "I created a weapon to defend my country," Mikhail told an interviewer in 2002. "I never imagined it would become the preferred tool of insurgents, terrorists, and child soldiers worldwide." The reliability that was meant to protect Soviet lives has enabled conflicts that serve no defensive purpose. His voice carried the weight of a man who had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams and discovered that extraordinary success could be its own form of suffering. The peasant's solution to military inequality had created a new kind of inequality, one where access to effective weapons became a determining factor in every local conflict. Letters arrived regularly from veterans who credited the rifle with their survival, but also from journalists documenting its use in wars far from Soviet borders. The weapon appeared on flags and emblems of liberation movements, in the hands of characters in films about conflict, as a symbol of both resistance and oppression, depending on who carried it. In his final interviews, Mikhail reflected on the relationship between engineering intention and historical consequence. He had solved a specific tactical problem with characteristic peasant pragmatism, creating something that worked regardless of conditions, training, or maintenance. But that very pragmatism had made the weapon universal in ways no sophisticated design could have achieved. "Perhaps the fault was in solving the problem too well," he mused during a 2009 interview. A complex weapon would have remained in the hands of professional militaries. A simple weapon becomes available to anyone determined enough to acquire one. The symbolic weight of this legacy followed him through his final years. At veterans' gatherings, he was celebrated as the man who had given Soviet forces the tools they needed to survive. At international conferences on conflict resolution, his name was associated with the proliferation of small arms that made regional wars more persistent and deadly. He died in 2013 at the age of 94, never having fired his rifle in anger, having spent his final decades advocating for peace while carrying the complex legacy of having given the world its most enduring tool of conflict. The simple, reliable weapon, born from a peasant's determination to protect his comrades, had become synonymous with violence far beyond any battlefield he'd imagined. Today, 75 years after that first successful test in the Soviet proving grounds, children in schools and museums learn about the tank mechanic whose fever dreams reshaped modern warfare. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mikhail Kalashnikov's story is not the weapon's ubiquity, but the humanity of its creator, a man who understood mechanical systems intuitively but could never fully control the social and political systems his engineering would influence. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that endured, it was the mind behind it, and the reminder that history's most consequential innovations often emerge not from grand institutions, but from individual conscience, confronting impossible problems with uncommon determination. The taste of that moral complexity, like the winter air in a Siberian workshop where a young mechanic first assembled the rifle that would reshape warfare, remains sharp in memory decades after the prototype was complete. The simple truth Mikhail learned was harder to carry than the complex lies of doctrine and propaganda. Good intentions, pursued with extraordinary skill, can create consequences that stretch far beyond any single designer's ability to predict or control. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.